This is Mike Guardia, and you are watching the Break It Down show.
Mike's been on several times. Every time he writes a book, he basically comes on the show. He writes a lot of books. This latest one's called Days of Fury, the Ghost Troop in the Battle of 73 Easting, which is, I guess that's a good place to start already. We always have to talk about Easting because what the heck is that? Is that a street someone lives on up in Southampton and Benicia, where I'm from? No, it's not. Tell us what Easting is.
All righty. So Easting, in the parlance of the military, refers to a longitudinal grid line on a map. And it's called the Battle of 73 Easting because in the flat, featureless deserts of the Middle East, no identifiable landmarks, so you got to name your battles by where you're fighting on a map.
And when you say longitudinal, those are the ones that go pole to pole, as opposed to latitude that go north and south. And so it just kind of helps you figure out where we're at. What's interesting about this era of fighting is, I guess, Blue Force Tracker was nascent, maybe not present in all units. You know, it was starting to kind of come out. But most importantly, GPS became a thing where we could start to know where everybody is.
Right. Yeah. So that was really the first conflict where GPS came into its own. And as far as a Blue Force tracking system goes, we were really reliant on the Air Force to help increase our situational awareness of where our friendly elements are and where our not so friendly elements were.
What does that mean, though, in terms of explain that in the context of the times and what a difference, what a leap that. I mean, now, like, literally infantry platoons can launch their own drone, and there's drones above that. And then there's satellite. I mean, there's real time where things are looking at kind of, but that wasn't the case back then.
No, it wasn't. So about the most advanced thing that we had was this system called the Trim Pack GPS, and it was about the size of a modern day car stereo. And you only had enough of these things to go around, and you could only use them at certain times of the day because the satellites would have to be in a particular position for you to get the proper grid coordinates. And for everything else, you would have to rely on the Air Force fixed wing assets, these modified 707s, who would be using their own interconnected systems of radars to be able to tell a unit on the ground, okay, here's your frontline trace. And maybe 5 to 10 clicks out in front of you, there's going to be a not so friendly element, and it's a bunch of constant 2 and even 3-way communication, which it did help situational awareness. Oh my God, it was information overload for a lot of the people on the ground trying to make sense of all these reports, listening to like 3 different radio nets, stuff like that.
Yeah, that's right, huh? Because that you're used to. I mean, you've trained up for decades on a different kind of combat, and now you're getting information overload. Because, I mean, before that, and for the Iraqis, they didn't have these advantages. I mean, if anything, we blocked out their satellite communication.
Yeah, they were really fighting in the dark, and in many cases, they were fighting blind. And they actually expected that to work in their favor, because they weren't counting on the coalition forces to have things like GPS, to have things like radar tracking systems. And they said, okay, well, if we ourselves are getting lost in the deserts of the hinterlands of Iraq, then I'm sure the Americans are going to get lost too. So if we stay put and do some tight interlocking formations, we're going to be able to find some wayward coalition unit and be able to win the day like that. Severely underestimated our SA capabilities.
SA capabilities. Help us know what that is.
Oh, right. So SA is an acronym for situational awareness, and it's basically just anything that gives you more of a real-time look at what's going on in the battle right in front of you and the battle happening on your left and your right.
I remember reading a news story when this whole thing was going on. They talked about how the Iraqi army was the 5th biggest army in the world. Of course, later on, the joke was they got turned into the biggest track team in the world. But this was no joke. Like, leading up, like, this was going to be a nasty, hard fight because an experienced, I mean, probably the most recent big, combat maneuver kind of army. I mean, experience was the Iran-Iraq War, and this is only a couple of years later. I mean, really, you could measure it in months between the end of the Iran-Iraq War and the Storm Desert Shield era. It's is it surprising when we look back at how much we overestimated the Iraqi army's capability?
Well, I'll say yes and no, because we were going up against we were going up against what was a numerically superior force, and they had recent combat experience. Not only was it recent, but it was also in their own backyard. They had fought the war on their own terrain, and they were equipped with the latest and greatest in Soviet armor. And we really expected, okay, they may not have the same level of training and the same level of professionalism that we do, but they have a quantitative advantage in their equipment, and they can accomplish a lot just by virtue of brute strength. I think it was Joseph Stalin who said, quantity has a quality all of its own. And they said, we're probably going to win the day, but it's going to be a very hard fight. And a lot of the talking heads, a lot of the defense experts were saying things like, hey, we anticipate as many as 20,000 casualties on the first day of the ground war alone. And because we knew we were going into the fight outnumbered, that's why we were so big on having a coalition of the willing come in to try and inject the Iraqis. But we did know that our equipment, that most of our equipment would be qualitatively superior. And there was little question, I think, in anyone's mind that we had probably the most professional and the most effective fighting force that we had had in probably 2 generations at that point.
And there's a small sliver of time where this was actually possible. But let's talk real quick. Let's compare and contrast the M1A1 Abrams and the Russian tanks, because the T-72 was supposed to be a pure machine, but when you hear about how they were deployed, they don't seem like peers at all.
No, they aren't. And the thing with the T-72 is that by itself, it's actually a pretty effective tank. It was the right tank for a war that would be fought on the plains of Europe in the 1970s and possibly even the early 80s. But by the time the M1 Abrams came online, its fire control system, its optics, and pretty much anything that made the tank viable on the battlefield really couldn't hold a candle to the M1 Abrams. Here you had a tank that was at least half a generation ahead of even the best thing that the Iraqis had on the ground at the time. And I think what a lot of people also have to remember is that the Soviets, whenever they exported their tanks or their MiGs or their Sukhois, they never exported the top quality variants of the products that they built. I mean, granted, not a lot of the Soviet equipment was that good to begin with, but they were selling degraded copies of their T-72s and their T-80s out to these exported countries. So an Iraqi T-72 isn't going to be of quite the same build and quite the same quality as a homegrown Soviet-built T-72 tank.
And in terms of like the fire control, I mean, there's different theories, like, there's manually loaded, there's automatically loaded.
Right.
And then like our tanks, if I'm not mistaken, can drive 50 miles an hour and fire the main gun basically at the same time. I mean, maybe you have to stop for stability purposes. I don't know. But the T-72, there's a dude in there going, trying to turn the main gun around. That has to be terrifying when you're a tank. I mean, just to be, I don't, as a spy, I want to be out of a tank. I don't want to be anywhere near the inside, even an Abrams in it,
All right. Well, yeah. You see, the thing with the T-72 is that it had a pretty good mechanical system, and it also had a pretty good drivetrain. But I think one of the things that made it a liability on the battlefield, if I can narrow down the list to just 2 big qualities, the first big liability that it had was that the Soviet tanks tended to store their ammunition in the hull of the tank. So what would happen if a tank sustained a direct hit at the right place? It would ignite the ammunition and it would blow the turret right off the tank. That's why you saw a lot of the Desert Storm veterans calling these tanks pop tops, because the top would go flying kind of like a bottle cap. And another thing was that the T-72, it's weird when you think about it, because when you think about this thing that I'm about to describe, you think it was an asset, but it was actually a liability. The T-72 had an automatic loader. It was a 3-man tank. You had a commander, you had a gunner, and you had a driver. Well, the automatic loader you would think would be an asset, but the T-72 had the same problem that the BMP did. The automatic loader was very mechanically clumsy. It would break down a lot. The hydraulics wouldn't work exactly the way they should. Things would get caught. You'd have rounds that would get double feeded into that would get double fed into the breech, and it became more of a liability than an asset. Whereas in the M1 Abrams, yeah, you have a warm-blooded PFC or a corporal who's playing the loader, but he has what the machine doesn't. He has real-time sensing of what's going on, and he can pull out the round and he can troubleshoot anything that's on the main gun within a matter of seconds, while the automatic loader on the T-72 is still going through its mechanical choreography of trying to fit a main gun round into that breech. And in the life or death world of tank combat, man, just those few seconds can mean the difference between a dead crew and a live crew.
Let's back up, because I just kind of wanted to set the stage with technology first, because it is such a big leap forward. But let's back up to the conflict itself.
Yeah.
How does all this start? How do we even end up in Iraq? I mean, I think we need to cover that, because a lot of us know, but there's a whole lot of people that have been born since then have never even heard of these kind of fights.
Yeah. So the relationship that we had with Iraq actually stretched back into the earlier part of the 20th century. They were among one of our closest allies in the Middle East at the time. As a matter of fact, as early as the 1950s, we were training some of the Iraqi fighter pilots over here. So we had a long, continuous relationship with Iraq from almost as long as that country had been in existence. And then you had Saddam Hussein, who came to power in the very late 1960s. First as the vice president, then eventually he rises to power and becomes the president of Iraq. Well, he does a lot of things to modernize Iraq, try and bring it into the fold of the 20th century. And in more ways than not, he actually does a lot of modernization and industrialization that brings Iraq right up to the cusp of being a first world country. But his fortunes change in the wake of the Iranian Revolution, because when the Shah of Iran gets deposed and the Ayatollah Khomeini takes over, well, the Ayatollah Khomeini is a Shiite Muslim, okay? Iraq's population is majority Shiite, but Saddam himself is a Sunni Muslim. So he's looking across the border and he's telling himself, gosh, if the Shah of Iran fell that quickly, I'm afraid that his rhetoric is going, the Ayatollah's rhetoric is going to galvanize Iraq's Shiite majority and make life very difficult for me. So he launches a preemptive strike against Iran right after the Iranian Revolution is done. And he's hoping to take advantage of the chaos and instability following the Shah's exit. And for the first few years of the conflict, Iraq actually has the upper hand, but it quickly devolves into a stalemate, lasts a good 8 years, finally ends in 1988. And Saddam is now straddled with this billion-dollar war debt, most of which has been financed by Kuwait. And since he can't really pay his war debt, what does he do? He decides he wants to invade his neighbor to the south and justify it by saying, oh, well, there's been a long-standing border dispute between the two of us, and they're slant drilling my oil across the Kuwaiti border. So, yeah, this invasion is justified. Everybody knew it was bogus, but, madman is going to do what a madman's going to do, right?
Yeah. There was also the claim that they were, at the time, the 19th province. They had always been part of Iraq, and they were just claiming what belonged to them, And then, is it America that just says, let's go? Or is it something different that goes and rebuts this?
Yeah, well, so America was leading the charge. And, as a matter of fact, I have vague memories back then of George H.W. Bush getting on TV and saying, this aggression will not stand, this aggression against Kuwait. And what he does is he goes through the venue of the United Nations and says, look, here's this unchecked aggression against Kuwait, unwarranted, uncalled for. Let us give Saddam a deadline to where he can make a full repentance of his transgressions. But if he doesn't eject himself from Kuwait by this particular date on the calendar, then we're going to go in after him. And Yeah, so it was one of the I think it was one of the few conflicts in modern history where we had the full backing of the UN and almost everybody was on board.
Why does the UN care about this? Why not just go, hey, that's a Middle Eastern business, that's Iraqi and Kuwaiti business?
Yeah, well, they probably thought that at first, but they figured, okay, well, this has the potential to destabilize the region and have a snowball effect, and it can escalate to a level that we don't want it to go. First of all, when Saddam invades Kuwait, that puts him in control of a rather sizable percentage of the world's oil reserves, and then he starts massing his forces along the border of Saudi Arabia. Now, in 1990, Saudi Arabia was our closest ally in the Middle East, and the House of Saud certainly did not want to see any Iraqi tanks rolling across their border. And I think everyone at the UN Security Council was of the same mindset. Well, gosh, if he ran over Kuwait that quickly, Saddam has the fourth largest army in the world and the largest air force in the Middle East. He's going to be in charge of nearly 30% of the world's oil reserves if we don't stop him. And there were quite a few people, George Bush Sr. included, that said, "Hey, we're dealing with Hitler reincarnated here. So let's try and seize this moment to stop aggression before it escalates into another situation like we had in Europe in the 1930s."
What are your thoughts? I mean, you've looked at this. You're familiar with a lot of the other secondary history that kind of applies to this area.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a better way? I mean, I would submit that the Middle East is less stable now, or equally as unstable, because it's kind of hard to say that the places are very stable, because as soon as this one little pocket gets stable, the other pocket is in chaos. But you had this three-state, I'll say, parity. You know, they may all want different opinions posed, but we're not any more stable now. So what else could have happened? Should we have just left this alone before kicking off all of these Middle Eastern incursions? Or was this probably the best path? I mean, or maybe something else. Maybe you've got a different option.
Well, when I think about the Middle East and its history, not only in terms of the 20th century, but for centuries on end beforehand, I think it would be hard to call it stable at all. I think stability has been the exception there. It has not been the rule. And there are as many reasons out there as the day is long. But for this particular conflict, what I think we would have been better to do is, I think that we should have gone into Kuwait. I think that Desert Storm was a necessary conflict, and I'm in two different minds about this. On the one hand, I think that if we had 500,000 troops in the desert and the backing of the international community, that would have been the time to do some regime change and not wait 12 years later to go back into Iraq again with Operation Iraqi Freedom. So that, I think, would have been easier to pull off, and it would have been the logistical picture, I think, would have been a lot simpler. That's just my theory. I also think that if we had left Saddam in power to just keep things as they were with the no-fly zone, follow a policy of containment, and do whatever it is we could to keep him in his box, because it's seeing how everything has played out post Iraqi freedom, it's hard for me to give a soldier's blessing to the current state of affairs in Iraq, and also with Syria and ISIS and all that other jazz.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so those are just my opinions. I think those would have been two viable options. I think the time to do regime change, if we were going to do it, would have been back then, when we had a wider berth of support from the international community, and we had more resources, really. Because the international community, I mean, I know I use that term loosely. An ally today could be an enemy tomorrow, and I think history has shown us that. But we had the resources and we had the wherewithal. It would have been much easier to do back then.
Yeah, and our ability to pick a reliable replacement hasn't proven to be reliable.
No.
The other thing I want to make sure we say too, because it's easy to sit back here 30 plus years later and look at this and go, aha, you were all wrong. But that's not the point of this. It's just to illustrate the complexity. Also understand that, the the Cold War, in effect, was over at this point. I mean, we were looking like, what's next? Oh, this could be the next thing. And so it's like, well, how do you respond appropriately when you have this aggression? And we are tied to Middle Eastern oil, and there are important things. It's a challenging problem. Any thoughts on that with the timing of the, all of the Cold War stuff ending?
I do. Yeah. So I think that, I think if it showed us a few things, it showed us one that, even when you think a big geopolitical game changer has started, and you're not going to need a big military establishment anymore, there's always going to be something that comes up that's going to surprise you, and something that's going to make you think twice about everything you held as truth just a few years or even a few months ago. Because one of the things that I've said in some of the presentations that I've given, and that in some of the college courses that I've taught, is that you think things are going to be a certain way, and that the geopolitical picture is going to go a certain course, and then you have something that comes out of left field and totally surprises you. I tell folks that, hey, in 1980, everybody knew we were never going to go to war with Iraq. In 1950, everybody knew that we were never going to fight a war in Vietnam. And in 1885, everyone knew that we would never fight two wars with Germany. And in 1750, everyone knew that 200 years later, we were still going to be British.
Yeah. And you're right. I was thinking about, like, it's like you're trying to bowl, right?
Yeah.
Like, I know my pattern. Maybe I won't always get a strike, but I know how to roll the ball straight down the lane.
Right.
And someone comes in and just kicks the crap out of the ball, while it's rolling down the lane. We go in, we invade Cuba because someone blew up a ship, or not. Maybe it didn't. Maybe it was just an accident. Right. So it means, like, what the hell's going on? You never know what's going to happen. These things are, they don't go out and work like we want them to, and when it does work out, good Lord, it's hard. People, lives.
Yeah. And, there is probably something to be said for not trying to do nation building and not trying to do any regime change at all, because I have heard some voices out there on both sides of the political aisle that say, if you want to win a war, you just go in, you smash, you trash, and then you leave. And you just make it clear that, hey, if person X or, whatever regime makes trouble for us again, then we're going to come back and we're going to do this over again.
Yeah.
You win the war, you make sure the enemy feels defeated to the point where he's going to think twice about making trouble for you again.
Yeah. And that probably won't work either. Because it's too hard. Okay. So you write a lot of different books about a lot of different topics, military history, like about equipment, about units, about people. Why this book? Why here it is right here. Why this book?
Okay. So for me, I've always had a special fascination with the events of the Gulf War. I'm of the oldest cohort of millennials out there. To all the viewers, I'm sorry, I'm a millennial. I know we have a terrible reputation in today's workforce, but this was really the first major conflict that happened in our lifetime. We were in grade school at the time, but a lot of us remember watching the nightly news with our parents, and it was explained to us as young grade school children. This is what a war is. This is what it looks like. Here are the good guys. Here are the bad guys. And kids, pay attention, because when you grow up, you might see something like this. You might see something like this later on. So the Gulf War itself always fascinated me, and I picked the Battle of 73 Easting because I think in a microcosm it represents the remarkable change that our military went through post-Vietnam. Here you had, right after the Vietnam War, the Army was at its lowest ebb. Training, equipment, professionalism was at an all-time low. But then within less than a generation, you had the most professional, most effective fighting force the world had ever seen at that point destroy the fourth largest army in the world in less than 100 hours. So it was just an incredible story that I felt really needed to be told, and told through the lens of those who were there on the front lines fighting it. Because, you know, they give such an intimate perspective of combat and what it's like in these life and death situations. And they just add a dimension that I think you can't really get if you look at history from a parochial level.
We're fortunate that we're able to do these things a lot more closer to the time that they actually happened. I mean, you actually have talked to Hal Moore before writing about his leadership and his life. The folks who were in these units, I mean, H.R. McMaster, come on, you know, in the book, and he's been in the news most of the last 4 years. So a little bit about the ability to go out and reach these guys and talk to them, you know, within a very strong living memory of what actually happened.
Right. Yeah. And I feel incredibly blessed because not only are so many of these veterans still living, but they are more than willing to share their stories. They're more than willing to share their time. And I found a common thread through all of the veterans that I'm able to interview is that, you know, whether they fought in the Vietnam era, whether they fought in Desert Storm, or whether they're more recent veterans of the ongoing war on terror, is that sharing these stories, I think, on a very real level is therapeutic for a lot of them. And it helps bring closure, and it helps let the broader public know that, you know, if people do go into harm's way, these are some of the downstream effects of what happens.
What are some of the downstream effects? I mean, it's one thing to talk about how much they kicked ass, but there's when those tops are popped, there's 3 to 4 or 5 dead souls inside that tank, maybe.
Right. So a lot of the downstream effects that I've noticed is, you know, and I know I'm probably going to paint a broad stroke when I say this, but they deal with the various aspects of PTSD. A lot of times they deal with survivor's guilt. A lot of times, and I think this is true for a lot of veterans, there's always a strong tendency for us to second guess ourselves. And when we're looking at things in hindsight, we tend to beat ourselves up saying, okay, what could we have done differently? Is there something that any one of us could have done that would have made a better outcome? And it's those feelings and those tendencies that are amplified tenfold when you're putting someone in such an intense situation like what you had at the Battle of 73 East.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that too, the battle, because that's what the book is about. But also, it's interesting. So, you know, so we go through the berm for the audience. There's a giant earthen berm that we blast through, and that's how we enter into Iraq. And for the first time, probably ever, the line of battle is moving at, I don't know what, 40 miles an hour. I mean, it's just flying, and at times it had to stop, but only because it was going so fast. I mean, this is my that they're like, oh my God, it's going so fast. You know, how are we going to keep up? But I mean, you have fuel tankers driving and chasing these tanks basically as fast as they can drive. And I'm probably not making that 100% accurate, but talk a little bit about the speed of this conflict and the massive difference between that and what the Iraqis were doing.
Right. So the conflict itself started off, I think, on a pretty fast-paced note. For the first day or 2 days of the conflict, when you cross the berm into Saudi Arabia, you have these armed formations that were moving at, you know, in terms of armored warfare, if you're moving at 35 or 40 miles per hour, that is really fast. I mean, that's at the upper ends of the speeds that these armored behemoths can go. But what I found interesting is that when you get into the battle proper, you actually see these assets start to slow down in their speed. And even though things are happening at a mile a minute, and you're firing your gun in succession, you know, one main round's going out of the tube after another, the speed of the vehicles themselves actually drops down to as low as, you know, as slow as 5 to 10 miles an hour. And, you know, one of the things that I got from the veterans is that, you know, it seems counterintuitive that you would be moving that slow, but you actually need to move the vehicle that slow in order to maintain good situational awareness of who's on your left and who's on your right. And it's weird because you don't even realize that you're going that slow because your mind is focused on how fast the main gun is firing, how fast the coax is firing, how fast your 50 cal is going off. And you get a false sense of how fast that you're going, because when the battle was over, they were going through the logs and they were going through the reports and they were doing their calculations. They're like, wow, we cut across this battlefield at barely 5 kilometers an hour. How is that possible?
Yeah, that's funny. And then when you again, we're doing like this combined approach too, because we have Kiowas, Apaches, all these helicopters flying in support. We have AWACS off over Italy somewhere communicating, and you're putting a lot of information. Let's talk about that again. We're like, so now we're coordinating all this stuff. You know, a Kiowa pop dome up over the top. There's like, there's 100 tanks over here. Here's where they are, you know, and all of these things are combined into this. So that 5 miles an hour really is pretty, like you said, it's pretty fast when you consider that all things that are being processed.
Right. Yeah. One of the things that really stands out about Desert Storm is that this really was an information age war. That you had more electronic assets, you had more real-time communication, and it's weird because you see it and you read the stories about how all of these electronic assets are communicating with each other, but those who were actually on the ground and even the equipment operators themselves came back and said, well, you know, there were so many things that we could have done differently. We were very close on a number of occasions to having fratricide incidents because there were delays in information relays. And one of the 73 Easting vets that I spoke to in particular, he said that he was glad that Desert Storm taught the Army and the Air Force one thing. It said how to tighten up their communication, because we were just starting to get this off the ground at the tail end of the 1980s. And a lot of the hiccups and lessons learned from Desert Storm really helped improve our comms and our SA and made it into what it is today.
Yeah, that reminds me, like even radios had jumped forward pretty far. You know, we had not enough SINGARs for everybody, but you had a lot better ability to communicate laterally. But then you realize you have to communicate spherically, you know, on different channels with different units. And like you said, you get all these multiple feeds in your head. How was fratricide? I mean, how much? I mean, there has to be some, because it's a dangerous thing and accidents happen. How was it?
Right. Well, I have to tell you, as far as Desert Storm is concerned, the fratricide incidents that we had throughout that conflict were incredibly low. There have been a few video feeds that have been immortalized. You can even find some of these on Facebook, where, you know, a combination of fatigue, a combination of confusion and long work hours and delays in communication had American assets firing on targets that they thought were Iraqi, but just happened to be somebody else. There's one video that I can point any one of the viewers to of an Apache helicopter who accidentally fired on an M2 Bradley fighting vehicle, somehow mistaking it. I think the pilot identified it as a ZSU or perhaps an Iraqi BMP, but on the whole, I mean, fratricide's never a good thing. It's always a tragedy, and nobody ever means for it to happen. But just given where we were in the technological picture at the time, those incidents were so few and far between.
Yeah, and it's only gotten better. I mean, we still have it occasionally, but it takes a lot of chaos to make it happen. Yeah. And what about the tankers? You know, when they're in the tank, what were they relaying to you? What was hard about what they were doing? I mean, obviously, look, if you're a tanker, you're rolling around, you're killing tanks, you're having a blast, right? But combat's hard, and it's not always fun. And so, what were some of the things that you learned about that were maybe not as fun?
Well, the things that really stood out to me, they seem to focus not so much on the tank's capabilities and not so much on the difficulties that they had with maintaining situational awareness. It was really the after effects, when the speed of the battle started to catch up to them and they had time to process everything that had happened. That's when it really hit them that, you know, hey, wow, I was using a 50 cal machine gun, and, you know, I was firing at a line of Iraqi troops who were trying to kill me. But as I was firing the gun, all these body parts were flying everywhere, and, you know, gosh, that was that was a pretty intense thing. It was necessary, but it was intense, and, you know, just the thoughts, and I think the tertiary demons that they had to wrestle with, knowing that was what they did. And there was one particular story that stands out to me was that there was at one point in the battle where a tank actually had to run over some Iraqi dismounts. And the driver of that vehicle, he told me this, and I'll never forget it. He said that even over the explosions of the battle and the sound of the tank itself, I could still hear the man's bones break under the treads of the tank. And I think it's incredible how resilient these veterans can be, just to be able to come back from something like that and not let a lot of those very painful memories weigh you down or affect your ability to function later in life.
Yeah, it's horrifying. How
Yeah.
much contact did these guys see, and how soon did it happen? I mean, 73 Easting is a title, it's a space.
Right.
You have no sense for it. So talk about this, like the combat space and what it was like and how long, because this whole thing's over really fast. I mean, 100-hour war is not long.
Right. Yeah. So Ghost Troop's portion of the battle actually lasted a lot longer than some of the other troops that fought at 73 Easting. The space itself, if you can imagine, just imagine a seabed, right, that has been completely drained of its water, flat and featureless almost as far as the eye can see, and that gives you a good sense of the battle space. Quite a number of 73 Easting vets told me that it was ideal. Ideal maneuver space for tanks because it was wide open and you could engage each other from standoff distances. And quite a number of them told me that tank warfare in that respect really starts to resemble naval warfare. Right. That you basically have these tanks that are becoming dreadnought battleships in their own right, that are engaging each other from standoff distances. They're moving in these massive formations, and they said, "Gosh, it's like we're naval officers now." But there was one particular aspect at 73 Easting itself that was a critical terrain feature for both the Americans and the Iraqis. And it was just a very gentle slope. It was a very gentle slope that was about maybe 3 meters and maybe a 5% grade at its highest. But what I think a lot of cartographers and even a lot of military planners didn't anticipate at the time was that even in the flat and featureless deserts of Iraq, if you have a rise or a slope, even as shallow as 3 meters, that's going to be of a pretty big military significance, because 3 meters in the open desert can mean the difference between having defilade and not having defilade. And it was that defilade on that ridgeline that traced the 73 Easting itself that allowed some Iraqi vehicles to hide and not be able to be seen until the American vehicles were right up on top of them.
Wow. And then how does that go when the tank rises over the crest and there's tanks there, opposed to tanks? How does that all get sorted out?
Well, in a slugging contest of brute force, even if a BMP is firing at point blank, there's no way it can stand toe-to-toe against an M1 Abrams. So the Abrams, I don't think were ever at any risk in trading fire with the BMP, but the Bradley was a slightly different story. And it was the Bradleys that were on that frontline trace of 73 Easting that were the most exposed to fire. And it was one of the lone feral BMPs that was hiding in the low ground that was able to get a surprise shot against an American Bradley at 73 Easting, which resulted in the catastrophic kill for that vehicle.
Yeah, those linebackers are a lot less modern. like inside and everything else. Again, I would never want to be inside of one. I know this guy's entire job is to go inside. How did they fare in this more modern battlefield?
Well, they fared pretty well, actually. You had the tow missile launchers that were part and parcel to the Bradley, and they registered numerous kills on Iraqi BMPs, T-55s, T-72s. They fared very well. The one thing that I can attribute to the tragic loss of a Bradley at 73 Easting was a proverbial lucky punch from a BMP that just so happened to be in the right place at the right time. And I think what added to the picture was that the vehicle had already been neutralized from a main gun round from another tank. but either one of the original crewmen of the BMP had survived, or another wayward Iraqi from another vehicle or even a dismount got into the tank and started taking pot shots at the nearest Bradley they could find.
Yeah, wow. How much contact did they get from the moment they got through the berm until they get to 73 Easting?
So they didn't really see a lot of contact until about the second day out. And they were pot shots really that were being taken from a lot of Iraqi conscripts. And, these a lot of the frontline soldiers that had been put out there in the Iraqi wilderness had been conscripted at gunpoint. A lot of them didn't have shoes. A lot of them were dehydrated. They were starving. They had zero love for Saddam, but they felt compelled to fire off a few shots just for the sake of defending their homeland. And interestingly enough, when Ghost Troop came upon a few of these early Iraqi conscripts during the second or third day out into Iraq, they found one who spoke perfect English. I mean, his English was impeccable. He could even speak it without an accent. And it turns out that this was an Iraqi American who had studied at the University of Chicago. Wow. And he had been back to visit his family. And right off the streets of Baghdad, got conscripted by a Ba'ath Party hit squad that said, hey, go to the front lines.
Yeah. Jeez. Is that guy still around?
I hope he is.
I hope so. Yeah. When you say 2 to 3 days, my logistics brain kicks on and I think, how are these guys sleeping? How are they eating? How are they surviving? Because it's yes, you can stay up for 72 hours, but good grief, you are in bad shape at the end of that. And you're not getting a lot of rest waiting at the berm, because you're just in that tension. Like the spring is taut mode, right. And then you get released. So how was the living standards? How did they do that?
Yeah, so the adrenaline could only keep you awake for so long. Afterwards, sleep becomes easier once the adrenaline dump kicks in. And one of the things about armored crewmen is that they have the ability to sleep almost anywhere. They could sleep. They can sleep sitting upright. They rest their head against the scope of a gun, and they would catch cat naps as frequently as they could. And one of the things that they were able to detect about their own physiology is that because we were so amped up and because we were going through these cycles of adrenaline peak and adrenaline dump, we found that if we took cat naps anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes at a time, we could get a sprint of energy that would last for a few hours before we would have to cycle through another cat nap.
And how does the command manage that? I mean, these guys need sleep. And the older you get, the more you realize, like, it is dumb to stay up for 96 hours. Yes.
Oh, goodness.
But yeah. How do they manage that? You just like mandatory stop, everybody take a nap. We'll talk to you in 20 minutes.
Yeah, well, a lot of it was handled at the troop and even the platoon level. So what they would do is they would say, okay, well, if we're going to have a short halt here, we're going to cycle through a rest plan. The vehicle crews can determine who's going to be awake, who's going to sleep. When we stop for the night, we're going to have rotating guard shifts. Somebody's going to be on fire watch. Somebody's going to be on guard. They try to make it so that each soldier has an opportunity to sleep. And, it could be for as little as 20 minutes or it could be for as long as an hour. But everybody has a little bit of shut-eye afforded to them, and they could kickstart their physiology for the upcoming day. But goodness, I know what you mean. Here I am. I'm almost 40 years old, and I cannot do all-nighters like I could when I was 20.
Yeah.
That skill has left my body. I couldn't do it if I tried.
But you're young, you're like, hey, that was a hallucination. You're like, that's bad. You're trying to not kill yourself and other people. The living conditions things is really interesting. What about eating? Were they eating MREs? Were they getting hot chow from what you brought up? What was going on?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for most of their time in Saudi Arabia, they would get an occasional hot meal, and they would also have those. They would also have those prepackaged tray meals that that we had in the military. They would get those. They would also get some canned rations like the beef renouni, and but most of their diet was the MRE, the meals ready to eat, and that's what carried them throughout pretty much all of their time in Iraq. And MREs, for any listeners out there who are unfamiliar, those are prepackaged ration meals that are called meals ready to eat. A lot of them are sealed tight. A lot of them are freeze dried. They're not fancy or fulfilling meals by any means, but they do at least give you the amount of calories you need to get you through the day. MRE is also the subject of a very humorous alternate acronym. We all know that they stand for Meals Ready to Eat, but soldiers often call them Meals Rejected from Ethiopia.
Yeah. They've gotten a lot better, though. I mean, that era,
They have.
MRE, there was no heater. Like, once they put a heater in every pack, it's like, oh, come on,
Yeah.
forget about it. These instantly so much better.
Right.
And I also like how the military has its sense of humor, where it gives the instructions on the heater: put this against a rock or something.
Right.
That's just specified. I love that part. What about the aerial assets? I mean, these the ACRs have a lot of things above as well below the ground. Talk about their impressions of the fight.
Okay. So from the perspective of the pilots that were supporting this operation, you had a variety of rotary winged assets that were organic to the ACR itself, including the Kiowas and the Cobra helicopters. It was beneficial for them to be able to relay information and see farther than any of the ground assets could see. They would be able to tell what troop formations were out there, give a general description of what the enemy disposition was, and they said that it was very beneficial for them to be able to paint the picture for the men on the ground. But they said there were a few close calls with death. They said that they weren't necessarily afraid of any Iraqi anti-aircraft fire, but they said they were more afraid of being shot by their own artillery or their own mortars. Because when you're coordinating those aerial assets with ground assets and you have artillery that's supporting you in the back, or even mortars that are supporting you, you have to time those rounds, those indirect fire rounds, just perfectly so that they don't go through a rotor blade of a helicopter. And there was one helicopter pilot who actually commented on that very phenomenon, saying that he was a few kilometers out from the frontline forces when all of a sudden he saw these little black dart objects flying past his cockpit window. And, that actually startled him at first. And it didn't take him very long to figure out, oh, my God, those are mortar rounds. So he get on the radio and said, yeah, guys, if you could scale back those mortars for me, that'd be great.
That'd be great. I'm out of here. Yeah. Wow. What did we learn? Like, especially this part of the combined, and the joint approach. We did so much of this. Now you see Apaches all have radar and, just on top of them, or radar, whatever you want to call them. And then Kiowas are a lot more armed. Kiowas before were more of a reconnaissance thing. Now, they go out and tear things apart. What else did we learn along the way from all this fighting?
Well, I think that we learned, I think it actually validated quite a few things for us. It validated the dedication that we had to professionalism, the dedication that we had to the hard standards-based training, and just showed you that even though you fight outnumbered, small units initiative and dynamic leadership at the troop level is really what's going to carry the fight. And I think it highlighted for us in a lot of ways the difference between how the Iraqi army approached their tactical leadership, as opposed to how we approached our tactical leadership, because they were still working on the old Soviet model. Whereas, the lower level rank and file enlisted and the rank and file junior officers were expected to be automatons who didn't have a lot of independent initiative taking authority, weren't allowed to exercise creativity. But it was a night and day difference because we took the opposite approach and we said, hey, we encourage low level initiative. We encourage creative thinking. We encourage our people to think outside the box, essentially. And it was that metaphysical element that I think really carried the day for us, probably more so than any technological advantage that we might have had. Yeah,
that's true. When we trained Iraqis, 10, 20 years later, you still got that institutional culture of that's not my call, but it is your call. You're the guy here right now doing this. By the time you call somebody else and have them tell you no, the decision to largely given to somebody, that's really no shit how they solved it. And it was a tough thing to try to combat because it was how they did things.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask you, so all of this stuff is interesting, and they call this battle the last, major tank battle of the 20th century, but isn't it really just the last major tank battle? I mean, is there any reason to think that we're going to see anytime soon a real tank on tank fight? It doesn't seem like that's a viable thing to have happen anymore.
Well, not for the foreseeable future, but I do think that there is going to be another great tank battle in some form or fashion, however many years down the road. When you take a look at the geopolitical situation being what it is, you have a resurgent Russia, you have a resurgent China, and of course, North Korea has never been anyone's friend. All these militaries have very tank-heavy forces, and their tanks are nothing to laugh at. You have with the PLA in China, the Type 99 tank, which by at least based on what information we're able to gain from the public releases, is a very capable, very high-tech, hard-hitting tank. And then, of course, in more recent years with the Russian ground forces, you have the introduction of the T-14 Armada tank, which, by every standard has one of the best, if not the best, fire control system of any European tank out there. So, I don't think it's likely that we'll see a tank battle in the future. I just think that, with the three toughest kids on the block, Russia, China, and the U.S., I wouldn't be surprised if at some point in the future there's a tank battle that, if not involving those three countries directly, involves other countries using those tanks against each other.
Yeah, for sure. You could see that happening. Yemen and the Saudis or whoever it is getting to a fight with them. You can see that happening. The other thing is when you whoop someone's ass as bad as we did with the Iraqis, we sort of broke or closed the door on a lot of what nations wanted to try to do with combat. Here you see this massive army, well-trained, well-experienced, and they just get destroyed. And who wants to spend money on that anymore? So we sort of created this monster where, like you and I both know, you could take a 70-year-old bomb that may or may not blow up, throw it on the side of the road, and you will shut down an entire battalion as they try to sort out that problem, Yeah. And so at some point, because how else are you going to fight? You can't go toe to toe with a bunch of Bradleys and helicopters and all working in unison with all this data, except for it to get hyper small and just disrupt everything. I imagine a drone, without any kind of electron, like just drone just sent that a ways, with a sail or something, and it just goes. You don't care where it goes, just to cause chaos would be crippling to us because we wouldn't know what to do with it.
Right. Yeah. So the nature of warfare, in a lot of ways, I think has changed over the last 25 years. You've had all these technological advances. You've had new weapons that have come up, and they've been used in ways that nobody had ever considered before. And what I think it's done is I think it's diversified the picture of how we engage in combat. And I think it's broadened the scope of how we're going to approach these conflicts, because, I can think maybe, if I wind the clocks back to 1985, then, the dominant picture was, if we're going to win a war, we're going to win it with brute force strength. We're going to win it, by fighting tank battles on the plains of Eastern Europe. And we're going to win it with tactical nukes. And we're going to, it's going to be an all out gutter war, but fought largely on a conventional basis. But then you fast forward to the present day, 2021, and we now have the cyberspace equation in the picture. We have information warfare. We have electronic warfare. We have economic warfare. We have, drones. We have a much more sophisticated surveillance picture. And while I think those conventional assets are still going to be used, at least in some form or fashion, it's working much more in tandem with the softer asymmetrical assets than it ever was before.
Yeah. You might have a guy write some code and spin up a centrifuge, through Internet of Things technology breach, and all of a sudden it's like, boom, reactor's gone, and that's a tank to do that. So you're right. It's a much more complex fight now. And then also, I don't know if you know John Spencer, but he talks about the urban fight and how these urban structures and going and fighting and, buildings that are over 100 stories tall and having to clear it. It's a mess. It's a mess.
Right.
Interesting. What's next for you? What are you going to write next?
All righty. So let's see. Next in the hopper for me, as a matter of fact, I'm only a few days out from finishing the first draft of this next book I'm working on. It's called Skybreak, and it is a book about the 58th Fighter Squadron in Desert Storm. And their claim to fame is that they killed more MiGs than any other unit in that conflict. And they had the most number of MiG-29 kills, and they also scored the first air-to-air victory of the conflict. Incredible story. And I think what also needs to be put out there when you talk about the 58th Fighter Squadron is the incredible job that their maintenance teams did. They kept that squadron of F-15s at a 98% OR rate, which was unheard of even in peacetime.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about these miracle working crew chiefs, and so that's next. And then also on the horizon, I have a book coming out that is called Danger Forward, and that is a biography of a gentleman named Paul Gorman. Paul Gorman, 1950 West Point graduate. He was decorated for valor at Pork Chop Hill and stayed in the Army, and later became the architect of the infamous Pentagon Papers, and then also commanded U.S. Southcom while we had troops in El Salvador and also in Nicaragua.
Is he still with us, or is he passed?
He is still with us. As a matter of fact, this year he turns 94.
Can we get him on the show? Is he still with it enough to do that?
And if he can be on the show, I mean, by all means, I would love to send him your way.
Yeah. Let's do it. I'd love to have him on and support you and tell his story. These guys they're incredible. These people that have done incredible lives. I love celebrating them. Anything else you want to do in closing?
Well, I just wanted to give a shout out to every listener out there for the Break It Down show. To all of our fellow veterans out there. Hey, keep fighting the good fight. Everybody stay safe, and see you guys next time around.
Everybody get Days of Fury. Get it on Amazon. There's a link down below. If you're listening on the podcast side, it'll be in the show notes. It's hella cool. It's about military history. If you love tanks, this is your book. It is a lot of fun to read, and I just enjoy it. I think about the whole tank thing, right, Mike, with like a bigger picture in mind, and it just amazes me how incredible those guys are and how much they love people. It's a calling, and not all jobs are. Tanking is a calling. Is it tankering? I don't know.
Yeah.
All right, stand by. Let me sign this thing off. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you.